Colm, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you very much.
When we were told that Long Island was coming, a sequel to Brooklyn, we all got very excited and we were sent a short video of you explaining the fact that you hate sequels and that you had promised never to write one. So can you tell me what happened here and how we do have a sequel to Brooklyn?
I mean, if you think about the 19th century, if we had sequels to all those wonderful novels, Jane Austen, for example, it would really ruin those books. I mean, it could prove that Captain Wentworth just went back to sea, leaving Anne Elliot in Persuasion just landlocked and didn't send her money. And think about Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, was turned out to be a gambler and lost his 10,000 a year very quickly. And in other words, this could ruin these books. I think the whole point of a book, of a novel, is that you give the characters such a degree of autonomy in how they function that it isn't as though the author can constantly decide their fate. Mm-hmm. I mean, it mustn't look like this. It must look like as though the next thing happened could be predicted by no one. Now, this means that you end a novel with, allowing for that autonomy, that this is as much as was known at that moment. So you end the novel in a certain moment in time, so the reader believes beyond this moment in time, it was not clear what would transpire. Mm-hmm. So you got to give that idea. So there's a sort of aftermath, but it's not as though you're not disclosing the aftermath. The characters have not yet lived in the next time. And that has to be what a book is. If you start playing with that, saying, no, I'm going to give you, I'm going to move on. The question is, why did you not try that in the first book? If you needed to tell more of the story, then you should have included that in the first book. Mm. So in other words, just the only real ones that work are when they're set in very precise time, such as Pat Barker. Mm-hmm. It's the First World War, so she could do a trilogy. Obviously with Hilary Mantel, mm-hmm. you can do a trilogy in Henry VIII. But with this novel, Brooklyn, it ended where it ended. And a sequel to it would have been very dull indeed, because it looks as though she went out to the suburbs, she went out to Long Island, they had a little house, and she had 2 children, and everything seemed to go very well. So there's no drama in that. I mean, okay, spring came, and then there was summer, and then there was autumn, but that's not a novel. And you could try it, but it really would look as though you were being tedious. And I think you have a duty in life, I think, just not to be obviously or willfully tedious. And so I was walking along the street, and an image came to me that is the opening of this book. And I probably wouldn't have gone with it had I not been thinking about plot. And Thomas Hardy, the opening of the Mayor of Casterbridge, which is one of the great openings where, a man sells his wife towards the end of the 19th century and a man buys her. And what's going to happen now? You go, no matter what you do, you're going to have to deal with that. So it's called an action with consequences, which is called a plot. And so I was interested in the idea of, I'd never done it before, of opening a novel with something, that everything then from the rest of the novel would be the result, but not the direct result, mm-hmm. that could go for 100 pages without mentioning it, what the opening is. But you'd know, no matter what, it's going to have to re-emerge. And so once I got that idea, that it would be a different sort of novel, not character-led, not atmosphere-led, not rhythm-led, not language-led, but led by what is going to happen now. Mm-hmm. Then I would see, I could see that as a new way of working for me, rather than sequel. But it is a sequel in the sense the same characters, and you're dealing with, I suppose, unresolved experience. Matters that were not fully resolved in the first book are once again, there's an effort to resolve them here.
With that sort of, I suppose, that revelation you had as you were walking, and the idea of that first scene, were you very clear immediately what the consequences of that action would be? Did you know what the plot was going to be for the whole book, or did you work that through as you were writing?
I more or less knew the whole thing, right. But sometimes a new detail would occur to me, a new way of turning the plot further. You have to work very carefully with coincidence. You can do it twice, but you can't do it 3 times. Yeah. And also with who knows what and how they know things. So, and sometimes there were parts I didn't write that I felt later, this needs to be told, this part of the story. Mm-hmm. Whereas there's a good deal that's not told. I did have the whole thing in my head, yeah, I did, yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, there's, as you say, the book does pick up many years later from Brooklyn, and you do this rather brilliant thing of basically showing what happened in those intervening years almost with one scene. There's this fantastic dinner scene with the Fiorello family. Could you tell us a little bit about the dynamics of what's happening there? Because Eilis still feels very much like an outsider in this family and still somebody who is sort of keeping their inner thoughts to themselves.
Well, anyone who's ever married into a family knows this moment where you're at lunch with them all or dinner and they've all started to talk. It's a sort of shorthand. In a way, it's the language of love, but it sure doesn't sound like that. And so she's the only person at the table who isn't. I mean, her sisters-in-law have really integrated because they're Italian Americans as well. She's the only non-Italian American, and they, like a lot of people in America, not quite sure where Ireland is. It could be Iceland, it could be Scotland, and she's strange. She's sort of thoughtful in a way they're not. Except one brother-in-law. And therefore, at the long table, he's more and more feeling like a ghost. They just don't see her. But then one day she has an argument. And once that happens, it's absolutely clear there's no place for her there. It's just a small argument where anyone again who's had this argument with, there's a father-in-law who doesn't speak much, but when he speaks, they all listen. And she just disagrees with him about the Vietnam War. And they can't believe that it's called standing up to him, even though she just has a different view than he does. So, you're dealing with all that dynamic of marrying into a group and never feeling that you belong to them.
The devastating news that Eilis receives at the beginning of the book sends her, in part, back to Ireland, back to Enniscorthy, back to her mother, and back to some of the characters that we'll remember from Brooklyn. And you use a polyphonic narration here, so we don't just sort of live in Eilis's head, we also hear from your two previous characters, Nancy and Jim. Tell us a little bit about why you chose that approach to telling the story.
Well, polyphonic is a very grand term, I think. I mean, it suggests that it's a simple matter that the first section is all told through Eilis's perspective. So we see life as she lives it in Long Island from her side. The problem now is that when I take her back to Ireland, I want her not to know certain things. And I want her not to have experienced life in certain ways. Now, I can do that in two ways. One is to tell the reader, as the author, to start slipping in. Of course, she had not known, but then who's saying she had not known? So then I thought just to do something immediately, which is each time, you see, each section now has three perspectives. 1, 2, 3. And it goes the same way each time. It's her best friend, Nancy, then it's Eilis, and then it's Jim Farrell. So it's each time like that. First thing is each of them has to be more or less the same length. Because if you let something go too long, by the time you go into the next section, you'll have sort of forgotten this. And the minute you start each section, you have to make absolutely clear who, where, and when. In other words, if you're in Jim's pub, you have to be immediately not just saying, he went to the pub every morning, but just some immediate thing that's happening in the pub. So you get the reader straight into it. And it's all about it. I suppose it's a kind of choreography rather than where who knows what when, who sees what when. So if you do a wedding from two sides, from any two sides of a wedding, someone is having a wonderful time without realizing that over there, if they looked more carefully, they would see so-and-so talking too much to so-and-so. But they missed that. So you do it the first time with missing, and the second time you do it where, there's a complete other agenda going on at the very same moment. But you can only do that twice or three times again, where you have the same scene told from two perspectives. Because there are times when a scene won't lend itself to that. So, I mean, I tried all that. It only works sometimes. And I mean, when I say I tried it in my head. I wouldn't write it because I knew it wasn't going to work.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you knew straight away that just wouldn't.
Yes, there works sometimes, but don't try it on. I mean, a wedding is such a set scene. And it's also a scene where they meet on the beach, and that's told from two perspectives again, but shorten one of them. It's a constant game going on, where the fourth person in the triangle is the reader. And how much does the reader need to know here?
We felt as though we were very close to Eilis's, I suppose, interior life and her keeping of secrets in Brooklyn. But it feels to me in Long Island as if she's not alone in keeping secrets. All of the characters in Enniscorthy have something that they're holding on to. And there's almost a way in which, I suppose, Jim and Nancy are relishing the secrets that they have, for example, and keeping it from Eilis. Tell me a little bit about managing that as well, because you as the author, obviously, you know everything, so you have to decide who finds out what when. That must be quite a tough balancing act.
I think the first thing is that when Eilis goes home, and we're not giving away the plot, there are things she doesn't want to tell her mother. Because her mother will never stop going on about them, and she'll just ask her too many questions that will make the whole thing horrible. So she just decides not to tell her. Now that's the beginning. Her mother then will suspect there's something and be desperate to find it out. So in a way, the relationship between the two of them is soured very much by Eilis not just... But the reader should know it won't work if she tells her. The other thing that happened in Ireland, you see, what I'm trying to work out is, this is 1976. This is the last years of certain things that you can't do again in a novel. And one of them is a long engagement. Because engagement itself has... People get engaged still, but not in the same way. In Ireland in those years, you could get engaged and the engagement could last 2 or 3 years. Or you could get engaged secretly. Or you could get engaged as a big surprise on New Year's Eve. But that still happens, I think.
Yeah.
But a secret engagement... And there are really good reasons why it's secret. I mean, it's not just that they're trying to be secret, but they are enjoying it. They are loving the secrecy and the flitting around the town. And so there is a whole sense of drama around that. But of course, that becomes poisonous for the rest of the novel. So those are the main secrets, really. And what I want to make sure is that they're secrets that anyone could understand why they're keeping them. They're not just sort of Irish people in a constant state of hiddenness and, inscrutability, but that they are actually, there are good reasons for it.
One of the other sort of drivers of the novel for me was that the main characters are very in touch with their sort of emotional lives, but not sharing them. They're not sort of demonstrating those emotions to others. So there is this real charge to seemingly quite mundane scenes because of that.
There are a whole lot of new words that are not available to the characters in this book, but I've been learning. And I suppose one of them is the word transactional. And people talking about relationships as being transactional relationships. It was a funny word when I heard it first, but in a way that one of the characters, Nancy, who's Eilis' best friend, that her interest in her sort of romantic interest has an element of the transactional, in that you realise marriage will really rescue her from a terrible job that she has running a chip shop, and that that there is a very, very good reason why she wants this relationship to work. And it may be about emotion, it may be that she's in love, but certainly there are other needs besides romantic needs. And I wanted to put that there without naming it as transactional, but just to show the reader this is actually another form of love, but it's one that she can't lose this particular war. I mean, really, for her to lose would be for her to face into mid-40s, the rest of her life, putting fish and chips and onions. I mean, trying to do fried onions, onion rings.
See, the description of fried onions always was making me remember that smell. I liked it, but I can understand why you wouldn't want to live in it.
Well, yeah, I mean, her daughters are getting all snobbish because they've made money now, and they say that the oil and the fish and the chips are getting into the pores of their skin and their clothes, and people are making snobbish remarks to them in the tennis club.
Yeah. The other thing I read recently was that you had, after you'd finished the manuscript, you had almost a year before it was published, and you spent that time going in there and really trying to strip out anything that felt extraneous. Tell me about that process, why you did it, first of all, I suppose, and what you were trying to avoid.
It needed to be finished before. I teach at Columbia University from the middle of January, the day after Martin Luther King Day, and therefore it really had to be finished by that day, because I was going to get involved in all sorts of departmental politics and all sorts of other things, and teaching, and I nearly made the deadline, with about another week to go, and so that's January 23. Now the book is not printed probably until a year or a year and 2 months later. So I have all this time, and now obviously the publishers have seen it, but I start to read it. Now all I'm doing is just taking out the book, maybe printing it out, get some company will do that, you get it back, and just simply sit down and read it. Don't try and read sections of it, just the whole book as though you're the reader. And it's an amazing experience. I'm not sure how many writers actually do it and how much they do it, because you realize, wow, that section isn't needed, because as I'm reading it, it seems tedious. It needs to move, especially the first section where there's too much information about where she works. You need to move. She's got to go home soon. And so, yeah, it was cut, but it wasn't that I planned to cut it. It fell away almost. And not only that, but every time I went back to it, and I probably did it maybe 10 times. And just the leisurely business of reading. And in that leisurely business, you realize slowly that that story is being told too much. Bring it down. There's one scene, two scenes I added. And then a lot of stuff, not scenes as much as paragraphs, things being told twice, just bring it down and down and down, out, cut, erase.
I wonder whether that helps contribute to what is an incredibly pacey end to the book. Sort of last 50 pages or so, I was sort of racing through it. It's got a real change of pace. Was that always there and your intention, or did that come through that sort of editing process?
The problem there is that there's been a sort of an endlessness to their indecision. Mm-hmm. That in other words, two of the characters are being indecisive. Mm-hmm. Now, how often can they be indecisive? At some point or other, someone has to make a decision, and therefore you can't. Once you start that into the last stretch of indecision over, start with more indecision. But there's nothing else can be done. You see, you can do prevarication, you can do indecision, you can do postponement, but you can't go on with it. So once you get into the moment where actually it's close to her, basically it is that something comes from America, an image comes to her from America, and it's a photograph, and she sees something in it. And that just this has to be dealt with. Having up to then constantly done nothing, waited, watched, postponed. Now, for a second, she's decisive. Mm-hmm. And they're always very dangerous, those decisions. I don't know if you've ever made one yourself, but like in that second, you say, right, this is what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And it's against all the spirit of the novel for her to think like that. But that morning, she goes out of the house, and that is the end of the book because she makes a decision. And then we watch as that, and it might have been, but there is another plot line in that. Mm-hmm. But yes, it has to only now move towards everyone trying to decide. I promise you, if you go back once more to her saying, well, you realize this book is just some old guy, author coming up his mind.
Yeah.
So it moves, that 50 pages moves for a really good reason. I mean, it may move too fast, but I promise you the alternatives are too slow. And you can decide which.
Oh, it's definitely not too fast. It's thrilling to read, especially, and it's quite rare, I suppose, in what you might term a literary novel, that there's been all this sort of, as I say, interior life and indecision, and then it really picks up pace. It's very, very exciting. It does also lead to an ending, which, similar to Brooklyn, is not enigmatic, but I suppose it is slightly open. And of course, now that we do have a sequel, it might lead readers to question whether there might be more to this story in the future. I daren't ask you almost, but I'm going to ask you whether you think there might be more to say.
I'm getting a lot of, I don't know if the word, is the word pushback, it's a good word, it's one of those new words, pushback. I'm getting a lot of response about the ending. And the argument about ending a novel was had as most elevated in the 1870s between George Eliot and Henry James. But they only met once and they didn't discuss this, but in their books, that at the end of Middlemarch, George Eliot decides, I need to tell the reader how all these characters lived, the rest of their lives after the novel. That's partly because she's written a sort of panorama, and we do feel we have a right to know, did Ladislaw really become a member of Parliament? How did Dorothy, so it goes through all of them in this very, I suppose, plain prose. It's information almost, and it's added to the book almost. Henry James, in The Portrait of a Lady, written, 5 or 6 years later, at the very end, does something astonishing where we don't have a clue that Isabel Archer is thinking of going back to Rome, because we don't see it from her side. We just see things she's doing are happening to her. Suddenly it emerges that she's already gone back to Rome, to her husband. And that seems astonishing. You turn the page and say, surely we're going to see the next scene where we're going to have her with her husband. Now this is partly because he was serializing the book, and there was only a certain amount of space he had. And he ran out of space. But he did revise the book, but he didn't add to it. But the ending is completely open. It's completely, this isn't happening.
Yeah.
I'm falling off a cliff here. And they're the two arguments. I suppose mine is that I see this as complete. I see that final image being absolutely clear, and that is that is as much as is known. If you try and bring it beyond that, even for the rest of that evening, you move into, I think, very predictable and banal repetitions of the questions that have already arisen in the novel. You know, if you go to another chapter, there's nothing more that's going to be found out in the next one. At least in my understanding of how these characters operate, it's not as though someone is going to make a big decision again. So you just leave it at that. But as regards, I mean, the joke is that, I mean, I wrote the first 15 years ago, so I'm 69, so I would be 84. And it's a very big difference between being 54 to 69, and 69 to 84, in that I think we'd have to ask the nursing home for permission. Like, would you give him some paper? Do you mind if he writes? Is it okay if he types? You know, that, in other words, and the head might say, no, he's had enough. There's been enough trouble this semester. This year. You know, he's always getting out of bed in the middle of the night, and we can't control him. And you know, could you keep him calm? And you know what I mean? That the other inmates are really annoyed by him generally going on, telling you stories day and night, repeating. You know, like 84.
I wondered if I could ask about your relationship with your editor, Mary Mount, because it's a relationship you sort of stuck together over many years, and therefore it's clearly an important relationship. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about that.
I remember when I was publishing a novel called The Testament of Mary, and I did that thing I was telling you about. I took it out and read it, but I wasn't quite sure what to do now, you know. And I wrote to Mary, and this is true, I wrote to Mary, could you have a look finally at this book? And I wonder if you could do a bullshit read of it. If you find any bullshit in the book, could you just point it out to me? And she wrote back and said, do you mind if I really do this? And I said, I really want you to do it. And I mean, she rescued the book from your permanent laughter. I mean, where I was going into all sorts of flowery accounts of, you know, it's infinity, eternity, the clouds, the tumbling clouds, the moon, the sun, you know, earth itself, the clay, our place in the world. And like, it was all rubbish. And once it was gone, there was a book. I mean, it wasn't that much, but it was, you're talking here and there, I just lost it. Because I was trying to deal with these big questions, but big questions are not good in a novel. You better bring it down to a single image. And so, yeah, Mary was very good with that, and also with The Magician, the book I wrote about Thomas Mann. With this book, she was much more, I mean, hands off in the sense of that she didn't see major structural problems. And therefore, you know, we didn't have that bullshit read argument. But I mean, obviously, she did make suggestions, but it wasn't with the same level of, you know, the need for intervention, which might have arisen which did arise with The Magician. Just that Magician needed much bigger cuts. But with these cuts this time round, with this with Long Island, I did most of them myself over that year. We just almost every so often just take the book out just to see what was like. I had a lot of time. It was after the pandemic, but for some reason I would have those days, and I'm glad it did, because there are some things taken out that you would not believe.
And just to finish off, I wanted to ask about Enniscorthy, your hometown, where Brooklyn is initially set, and Long Island. Obviously, you in your own life have travelled away from Ireland, first to Spain and then to the US, where you now live. And so I wondered whether you still regard Ireland as home, or whether that relationship has changed.
Well, this novel, Long Island, is set in the summer of '76. That's probably the last summer when I was around Enniscorthy as a normal human being, just living there. So I have a sense of where people went, what people did. It's not exactly nostalgia as much as it's anchored. I know it. I can see it, and I wouldn't make, you know, what pub people went to. Who went to Dublin for what reason, you know? So in a way, it's the last summer I have there. And it'd be very hard for me to go into the 90s or the contemporary novels set in the town, because of course things have changed so much. So it's not as though going back there now as much as that last summer. You know.
Well, it's an absolute treat for readers, whether they've read Brooklyn or not initially, to be honest. Colm, I can't thank you enough for telling us more about Long Island. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.